Welcome to Lecture 1 of Bright Old Testament 510, the historical books, taught at the Blue Ridge Institute for Theological Education in Roanoke, Virginia. My name is Dr. Kyle Ferguson, and I will be the professor for this class. You can find more information at bright, B-R-I-T-E, -va.org. The first question to consider as we begin this class is what exactly are the historical books? In this class, we simply mean Joshua through Esther using the normal English order of the books. However, that is not the order that is used in the Hebrew text. In the current Hebrew Bible used by most seminaries, the fourth edition of the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, the books are in slightly different order. Ruth and Esther are found alongside Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, and Lamentations, in what is traditionally called the Five Little Scrolls, or the Megillot. Ezra, Nehemiah, 1st and 2nd Chronicles conclude the Old Testament. And even that order is different than the order found in the most complete Hebrew manuscript, B19a, the Leningrad Codex, that serves for the basis of our Hebrew Bibles. However, the original manuscript has 1st and 2nd Chronicles following the prophets. Ezra and Nehemiah conclude the Old Testament by themselves. Part of the reason that we see the historical books in different orders in different manuscripts or different editions of those manuscripts is that there is no such category in Jewish tradition of historical books. Instead, the Old Testament is divided up into three other categories. The 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, are referred to as the Torah. Nevi'im, the prophets, includes everything from Joshua through the end of Malachi. The former prophets being Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, the latter prophets being all the other prophets. The other books, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, are put alongside other books, including the wisdom literature and the Psalms, to give us the Ketuvim, the writings. So there is no historical books in the Old Testament, technically speaking. However, in this class, when we say historical books, we're using the English designation, which involves everything from Joshua through Esther, in the order that we find them in our English Bibles, understanding that they are found elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. Now that we have clarified what exactly we mean by the historical books, we need to ask the question, what do we mean by historical? What exactly is history? And what does it mean that a writing is historical? On the one hand, we might be tempted to say that history is simply what happened. It's the past. Except that's not quite true. History is technically writings about what happened. It's a record of what happened. The past, as we know it, has actually happened, and it is past. All that we have left is no longer the past. All we have is a historical record about the past. The key question then that we have to ask is whether or not the past can be determined from history. Can we discover what really happened from an account of what really happened? But therein lies a problem, and that is that a history, a record of what happened, is not just an account, it's not just a record, it's not just a list of the facts. It is, because it's recorded by human beings, it is by nature an interpretation of what happened. Consider, for instance, the history or the historical record of the Revolutionary War. We know that in 1776 the American Revolutionary War began. However, if you were to ask the British or British historians, they would probably not call it a Revolutionary War. In fact, they would probably say in 1776 the American Colonial Rebellion began. So whose interpretation of those events is correct? Well, obviously as Americans we would say the first, because that's the American interpretation. But you see the issue here, as we're writing history as an interpretation and an account of events, we often have differences of opinion. In this particular example, those differences are fairly large, but even among Americans as they view the Revolutionary War, they may have a different understanding of the reason, the motivations, the results, the outcomes of a particular battle, a particular series of events, something in the Revolutionary War, even though we are viewing it from the same perspective. If you want to see that in action, just simply ask Americans to discuss the Civil War, and you'll instantly see differences in interpretation. So does that mean then, in order to get behind history, we need to strip away all perspective to find out what really happened? Well, if we were to do that, if we were to strip away all the interpretation, we'd basically be left with saying that in 1776, some fighting started. And is that really history? Hopefully by now you're beginning to see the problem with that question. Can the past be determined from history? Can we find out what really happened based upon the historically recorded record? Really, we're left with a second question. Can anything be said about such a past? Is there any way that we can look at what really happened and give anything more than just broad details, such as in 1776, some fighting started between the American colonials and the British? Can we say anything about motivation? Can we say anything about causality? Can we say anything about results? Well, according to the empiricists, the answer to that question is yes. The empiricists believe that it is possible to strip away all of the bias from the historical record and be left with a true past, a foundational set of statements about what happened, about why it happened, and about the results of what happened, simply by using that scientific method, the empirical method, to get back behind the history. The skeptics, on the other hand, are a bit more realistic and say, no, it's not possible to go back behind the history and definitively say what happened, why it happened, how it happened, and what the results were of what happened, simply because the past is past, and we cannot know people's motivations. We cannot know people's thoughts. Those are in the past. The pragmatists take a middle road and say the skeptics are right. There is much that we cannot know about the past. The past is past. However, there is much that can be discovered by the empirical method. There is a lot of detail about the past that can be discovered from history without actually stripping away all of the bias of history in order to come up with an unbiased account without interpretation. We're still able to say quite a bit about the Revolutionary War based on the records that we have, even though we can't say everything there is to say about the Revolutionary War, everything there is to say about the past. We're able to look at the historical record and say, we know, in a large degree, we know what happened. However, consider for just a moment what is necessary for us to be able to answer this question about the past being determined from history, or anything being said about the past, from an empirical, skeptical, or pragmatic perspective. Basically, we're asking the question, can we know what really happened? But that gives the assumption that the history, as we have it in front of us, is not what really happened. Because we're looking at the history and we're trying to get behind the history to find out what really happened. But is that not the epitome of arrogance? To say that because the history in front of us has a particular perspective, because the author, the writer of that history is not completely unbiased, they're not a completely objective observer, because such a complete objectivity is impossible for any human being, therefore the history cannot be relied upon. Unfortunately, a group of scholars over the last 400 years, going all the way back to the 1600s and the scholar Spinoza, have concluded that no, the Old Testament historical books, because they have a bias, because they have an interpretation of events, are not historically reliable. However, they believe empirically, through a process called higher criticism or historical criticism, they can get back behind the historical text to determine what really happened. Unfortunately, these scholars seem unaware of the fact that they themselves have a bias as to what is historical. And so as they strip away the bias in the interpretation from the text, they are doing so according to their own bias and interpretation. For instance, those who hold to historical criticism typically claim that the supernatural does not exist. Therefore, anything supernatural in the text is not historical and must be stripped away from the text, revealing what really happened. The problem is that itself is a bias. They have interpreted events as not having taken place according to their own opinion and their own conclusion. So, really, in the end, the past, as they have created it, is no less biased and no less an interpretation than that of the historical books, which is why historical criticism, as a whole, is largely a myth. It is simply not possible to eliminate the perspective of the historian or the perspective of the student of the history. We all bring an interpretation to the text. The question that we really need to ask is what really happened, for instance, what we've been calling the past, is the past all that different from history, from the recorded account and the recorded interpretation of the past? For example, the Bible does not say that there was an event in the past where person A shot person B with an arrow. But the Bible, the historical record, records that person B actually died of leprosy. No, instead, what we're saying is that in the past, person A shot person B with an arrow. The biblical history, though, gives an interpretation of those events. God hates person B because person B is wicked. Person B actually told person A, I hate you and I'm going to kill your grandchildren and then I'm going to worship idols. And so God causes person A's arrow to randomly kill person B. Now, that biblical history is really not that different from the past event. The difference is that biblical history is not just an account. Again, it's an interpretation. But clearly, it's not that different than the past. It just simply comes with an interpretation of the past. In our modern perspective, though, we're tempted to ask the question, is that what really happened? Did person B really say what the Bible wrote that person B said? Was the author there? Did they overhear person B saying it? Or did they make up what person B said, putting words into the mouth of person B? Did a random person A really draw a bow and strike person B? Did the author interview person A just to see how random it was, or did they see it happen? Does the author really know where the arrow came from and who launched that arrow? These, however, are modern questions that we are tempted to ask about the text as we're trying to, in our minds, get back behind the history to what really happened. As we have already discussed, some of the answers to those questions are absolutely impossible. We simply cannot go back and interview the author. We cannot interview those who participated in the events or who were eyewitnesses of the events. So in that sense, the past is past. It's gone. All that we have left is the historical record. And yet we need to understand that to the ancient historians, what they wrote and what really happened were in their minds the exact same. They really believed that what they put on paper was the correct interpretation of events, was what really happened. Even though the ancient authors would at times put words into the mouth of characters in order to allow their histories to develop and to continue. That was accepted practice up until almost 400 BC with Herodotus, who was one of the first historians to say that what he said they said is what they really said. Prior to 400 BC, ancient historians would put words in the mouth of a character within their history, and yet they still viewed it as what really happened. For them, they were one and the same. So the answer to the question, is that what really happened, from an ancient perspective, is yes, that's what really happened. And really, we have to question if putting our modern understanding of what really happened, an understanding that has really only come about since the Enlightenment, of placing that upon the text of whether or not that's even appropriate, or if instead it's arrogant for us to say that the way that we do it is correct, and the way the ancient did it is incorrect, that our understanding of how to write a history is the better way, rather than the way they used to write those ancient histories. Again, we need to be careful about this question of what really happened, because it may belie some bias on our part, some arrogance on our part, and a misunderstanding of how the ancients wrote histories in the first place. For them, what really happened and what they recorded in their histories are the same. As we have seen, the past is almost impossible at times to reclaim, to see what really happened. And yet, what about those circumstances where we can have a fairly good idea of what really happened, and yet what really happened is slightly different from what is recorded in the pages of Scripture? Other data, other historical data, suggests that there's a different perspective. And as we look at the biblical text, we're able to see the individual perspective of the writer. We're able to see the bias of the writer, not just in a person A shoots person B, and yet the Bible gives a theological presentation of it, but instead, as we look at the pages of Scripture and then compare it to extra biblical data, we're able to see that other things have taken place than perhaps what is recorded within the Bible. For instance, in the book of Ezra, we have several letters that are recorded from Ahasuerus, the emperor of Persia at the time. And yet, as we examine those letters and then compare them to the other letters that are extant, that are still existent from Ahasuerus, we're able to see that what is recorded in the pages of Scripture is probably not the actual letter that was sent. In other words, the writer of the book of Ezra has recreated the letters, giving it in ancient Israelite perspective, ancient Israelite language, rather than what we would actually find from Ahasuerus. The same with King Cyrus, as King Cyrus, according to the historical record found in the Bible, declares that all Israel should go back because God told him to send Israel back. However, there's no record of this having ever taken place, and there's no perspective that Cyrus had a unique view of Israel as opposed to all the other nations whom he sent back to their homeland. So what are we supposed to do with instances like these? What are we supposed to do with other ancient historical data? For instance, that which is found in Genesis 1 and 2. Many people will argue that the scientific record suggests that Genesis 1 and 2 are not what really happened. So what are we supposed to do with texts like these? Again, we need to go back and remember that we are dealing with a perspective. We are dealing with, if you want to call it that, a bias. Scripture has a particular agenda. It has a particular bias. It has a particular perspective that is trying to pass on. And in that sense, it shouldn't really surprise us when we find slightly different perspectives or slightly different viewpoints outside of Scripture. But we need to remember they are outside of Scripture. They are extra biblical. For instance, as we look at the various genealogies that are found in the Old Testament, it would suggest that there are generations that have been skipped, generations that are not mentioned. That was very common in the ancient world not to list everyone. Does that mean then that this is unhistorical? Well, again, we need to remember that the Bible is inspired. That means that the position that the Bible takes on a historical event, the interpretation that it takes on a particular event, is inspired and is authoritative. So the question that we might be asking, for instance in Genesis 1 and 2, is that really how it happened? Is that really how the world came to exist? Is going against the perspective that God has offered us. God has said, this is how I wanted my people to view the creation of the world. How it happened, if we could ask that question, is largely irrelevant. Because if God had intended for us to think of it as happening another way, he would have told us from that perspective. But he gave us this perspective. The same with the historical events, such as the letters in the book of Ezra, the generations that are skipped from Nebuchadnezzar down to Belshazzar. God has given us a particular perspective that he wishes for us to have, how it is that we're supposed to view history. Now, on the one hand, it's possible that those other sources are incorrect and that the Bible is the correct source and the correct way to view it. But even if that's not the case, even if, for instance, in the book of Ezra, Ahasuerus wrote a different letter, Scripture has presented it to us using the typical methods of ancient histories, where they would create words and put them in the mouths of the authors, they would write letters and put them in the name of the person who supposedly sent the letter, whether they did or not. From that perspective, Scripture is telling us how to view the event. Scripture is telling us what we should think about the event. Scripture is giving us the authoritative interpretation of the event. So we need to be careful when we ask that question, what really happened? We're suggesting that there is other data out there that we needed. And yet the God of the Bible is saying, no, you don't need it. You don't need to worry about it. Instead, I wanted you to think of it this way. That last thought may make us a bit uncomfortable and cause us to question, are the historical books really historical? Well, if by historical we mean that the historical books of the Old Testament offer a perspective, they are biased, they have an agenda, giving an interpretation of past events which cannot be fully reclaimed and fully described, along with motivations, causality, and results, but can only be understood through historical accounts, and that the historical accounts found in the historical books of the Old Testament are written within the perspective and the definition of history and the methodology of history of the ancient world, and given to us as the inspired perspective of God, the authoritative perspective of those past events, then absolutely, the historical books are historical. Where we begin to question whether or not the historical books are historical are when we attempt to take an artificial definition of history from the 21st century, a post-Enlightenment definition of history, that is really not so much concerned about history as much as it is reconstructing the past and placing that on top of the text to get it to answer questions that the text never set out to answer and get it to adapt to our perspective of how history should be written. That's when we end up with the answer of no. But again, those are improper perspectives to place upon the text, as I hope you've seen. We have to approach the text from its own perspective, in its own time, with its own agenda, its own interpretation. In this case, the inspired interpretation of Almighty God. None of this discussion is meant to undermine our confidence in the historical reliability of the Bible. Even though we may talk about the past versus what really happened versus a historical interpretation of what happened, there is great historical reliability to the Old Testament. By cross-referencing names and places and events in extra-biblical data, we can find confirmation of events that took place in the Old Testament. Some events, like the destruction of the troops of Sennacherib as he besieged Hezekiah, are recorded slightly differently in Sennacherib's records, unsurprisingly. Other events that are recorded for us in the Old Testament are not recorded at all in ancient records, such as the drowning of Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea. But after all, if you were Pharaoh, would you really record that your army had drowned in your own Red Sea? And yet in other places we do find confirmation, such as Sennacherib's sack and exile of Lachish, not that far from Jerusalem. Jerusalem was probably able to see the smoke rising from Sennacherib's oppression of that city until they came and besieged Jerusalem itself. We also have the archaeological record where we're able to dig up and to see certain places, certain people, certain events. For instance, no one really thought that King David actually existed until we found an archaeological record that proved that King David existed. And that would be an example of an inscription. Others would be Hezekiah's pool, where he created the temple that connected the pool inside Jerusalem's walls to outside Jerusalem's walls. He actually wrote a message on the wall explaining how they made the tunnel. We have other inscriptions as well from the ancient Near East and from within Israel itself. So again, we have great historical reliability and confirmation that we can rely upon what the Bible tells us. For instance, this is a picture of an archaeological dig in the city of Jericho. You will notice in the foreground here are pictures of a wall. This is both a wall that has been left and then somewhat reconstructed based upon what was found here. We have actually found two sets of walls in Jericho, and what is remarkable is that the upper wall at some point collapsed and fell into the lower wall. Coincidence? Hardly. This is actually archaeological confirmation of the biblical story of the walls of Jericho collapsing and then the city being burned with fire. Both of these can be seen in the archaeological record.
again showing the historical reliability of the Old Testament.
What cannot be conclusively proven from the archaeological record is why the walls fell. That we need an interpretation, dealing with causality and results. And that is the type of interpretation that we find in the pages of Scripture, in the book of Joshua.
The same is true of the epigraphic, or the inscription record of the ancient Near East. This is the Merneptah stela, sometimes called the Israel stela, which is an inscription left by Pharaoh Merneptah, who was Pharaoh of Egypt from 1213 to 1203 BC. This is the first inscription that we have found, at least, that mentions Israel. It is the oldest inscription known to date that mentions Israel as a nation, as a state. This is a fairly significant theological and archaeological find because, again, it shows that Israel, in the year 1200 BC, was already known as a nation, already known as a group of people living in Canaan that in this case had actually been conquered by Pharaoh Merneptah. This particular inscription is called the Tel Dan inscription. A tell is a giant archaeological mound that may have layers of several different cities all built upon the same spot, found within. This archaeological dig found this inscription. It's from the 9th century, most likely inscribed by Hazael, the king of Aram. What is significant is that it refers to Israel as the house of David. This is one of the first, if not the oldest, inscription actually referencing King David. And for a long time, historians would say that David never existed but was a myth. But this particular inscription demonstrates that David was a historical figure and that he established a dynasty in southern Israel. This is just 3 examples, and yet the archaeological record and the epigraphical, the inscription record of the ancient Near East shows us time and time again how historically reliable the Old Testament is. The Old Testament historians may have defined history slightly different than we define it in a modern sense, and yet they are historically reliable. We can actually believe what it is that they said. Never have we disproved something from the Old Testament using archaeology or inscription evidence. Instead, we have only confirmed what they said. The historical books are indeed historical. This is a historical record, one upon which we can rely as we study the Old Testament. Within the last 100 years, the most influential theory on the historical books has been the theory of the Deuteronomistic history. That is, the idea that there is a consistent history running from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings. Because of the influence of this theory upon the study of the historical books, I almost feel like I need to give it a big intro. The Deuteronomistic history. Dun, dun, dun. This is, by far, the most influential theory. Again, that idea that Deuteronomy through 2 Kings comprises one history. You might be thinking, well, of course it's a single history from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings. It's all about Israel. Well, that's true, but that's not quite what the Deuteronomistic history theory is getting at. So let me take a step back and explain a little bit about the history of this perspective upon Israelite history. It began with the Pentateuch and the idea of source theory, that there were sources that were used by the editors of the Pentateuch to create the Pentateuch as we have it. The 4 sources that were hypothesized by Wellhausen, really building off the theories of others, was that there was a Yahwist, who preferred the term Yahweh when speaking of God, the Elohist, who referred to God as Elohim, the Deuteronomist, who obviously wrote Deuteronomy, but also other places within the Pentateuch, and the priestly source that had, above all, priestly concerns. As you can see, the Deuteronomist is the one that most impacts us today as we consider the historical books, because the work of biblical historians and biblical scholars related to the historical books builds off of the theories that there is a Deuteronomist that wrote the book of Deuteronomy. A scholar by the name of Martin Noth, he's German, so his last name is Noth, not Noth. Martin Noth took this theory of the Deuteronomists and expanded it, having noted the similarities between Deuteronomy and the material found in Joshua through Kings. He suggested that one author had written the entire Deuteronomistic history, beginning in Deuteronomy, writing all the way through 2 Kings. Again, he referred to this as the Deuteronomistic history because it was written by the Deuteronomist, who was taking everything in Deuteronomy and applying it to Israel's history. Thus, anytime he saw an influence of Deuteronomy in the other books, he took it as confirmation that the historical books had been written by the same author that wrote Deuteronomy. The modern approach to the Deuteronomistic history is slightly different than Note's approach to it. Today, it is more popular to speak of redactors than authors, suggesting that a redactor put together various sources that have been created by individual authors. Thus, it is more popular to talk about numerous authors and one or more redactors. In some theory, there are numerous redactors that have put together the various sources to create the Deuteronomistic history. One important fact to keep in mind, though, is that Note was largely influenced by historical criticism, meaning that he discounted anything supernatural in the text. That is, he was trying to get at what really happened rather than what the text said happened, buying so much into the modern conception of history that he discounted anything as the interaction of God, saying that what was historical lay actually behind the text. This is not an approach we will take, nor will we take the approach that a single author is the creator of the Deuteronomistic history. However, at the same time, there are elements of the Deuteronomistic history theory that are actually helpful, and those we will apply to our study of the historical books. For instance, we need to remember that there is an overarching structure to Israel's history. There is a movement, there is a deliberate connection between Deuteronomy all the way through Kings. However, I would not say that there is a single author or even a single redactor from everything from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings. I find the books very distinct from one another and find it highly unlikely that a single author would have composed the whole thing, nor do I find the idea of a redactor convincing, as now with the theory that there are numerous redactors, people are beginning to note the differences and just simply add more redactors to the pile. Again, I don't think this is convincing. However, there is an overarching structure that needs to be kept in mind. Not to mention the fact that the influence of Deuteronomy upon the historical books needs to be kept in mind, especially as this is the covenant of God with Israel. We cannot simply skip over the Pentateuch and jump right into the historical books. We need to understand that the Pentateuch is assumed by the historical books. We also need to keep in mind that the Deuteronomistic history emphasizes the presence of seams, that is, the way that books connect with one another. It does appear that there are deliberate seams, perhaps redacted, between the books. For instance, Judges ends with, "There was no king in those days, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes." And the beginning of 1 Samuel seems to know this, and to write the first several chapters of 1 Samuel in a style similar to Judges. The same with the beginning of 1 Kings, which seems to write in a style very similar to the end of 2 Samuel. Even though there is a deliberate seam at the end of 2 Samuel, ending 2 Samuel with a song, the same way that 1 Samuel opens with a song, and yet there is a connection leading into the book of 1 Kings. So we need to recognize the presence of seams in the way that books connect with one another. Most importantly, the emphasis upon the Deuteronomistic history is that there is a consistent set of themes, a consistent theology that runs from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings. This we would definitely affirm, whether it's a single author or not, and allows us to look for macro themes and pieces of Old Testament theology as we examine these books, looking at each book on a micro level, but also a macro level within the larger corpus of the historical books. The books can't be looked at in isolation from one another, but need to be looked at together. So in this regard, the Deuteronomistic history does highlight significant aspects of the historical books. We would just not go so far as to say that in order to examine those, we need to assume the presence of one author or redactor. So what about these other books, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ruth through Nehemiah? Well, these books are not considered to be part of the Deuteronomistic history. As we saw, they are part of the writings of the Old Testament, not part of the prophets, the former prophets, which are the historical books as we understand them. But we are including 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ruth through Nehemiah in our perception of the historical books because they are covering the history of Israel. The debate continues over who wrote Ruth through Nehemiah. 1st and 2nd Chronicles is easy because it was written by the chronicler, who was probably somebody from the priestly perspective, since there's a large emphasis upon the temple, As to whether or not they were actually a priest, there's definitely an emphasis upon the worship of Israel in the book of Chronicles, so that they're writing the same history as we find in 1 Samuel through 2 Kings, but from the perspective of Judah and the emphasis upon the temple in Jerusalem, the worship of God. Thus, we see that these are not part of the Deuteronomistic history, but they are part of the historical books as we'll be studying them in this class.
The book of Joshua is really a book of transition. It's not part of the Pentateuch. We don't have a Hexateuch, 6 books of Moses. We have the Pentateuch, 5 books of Moses, the 5 books of Torah, and yet the promise of the Exodus has always been that Israel would be in the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey. And yet as Deuteronomy ends, Israel is not in the promised land. The book of Joshua is really how the people of Israel move west of the Jordan River. You may remember that the land was given east of the Jordan River to Reuben, Gad, the half-tribe of Manasseh, but the east side of the Jordan River was never really considered part of the promised land initially. That was always west of the Jordan River, where Israel is currently not. They're east of the Jordan River. They're still in the plains of Moab. And so Joshua is really a transition from the Pentateuch, we're going to be in the land, to the book of Judges and beyond of now we're in the land. Joshua tells us about the transition from Moses as leader to Joshua as leader to then the rise of the judges, and then geographically Israel moving across the Jordan River into that land, as well as the inheritance that's given in terms of the allotment given to each tribe as to where they're going to live within the promised land. Joshua really concludes the story of the Pentateuch and the deliverance from Egypt, coming into the promised land, and yet it also sets the stage for the rest of the historical books, because it explains how the land is obtained that Israel will live in for the next several hundred years. The book of Joshua begins in Joshua chapter 1, indicating that Moses has died. The death of Moses took place at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. The first 9 verses of Joshua, then, in chapter 1, concern the transition from the leadership of Moses to the leadership of Joshua, and Joshua's commissioning to be strong and courageous and to lead the people into the promised land. Joshua is reminded, especially in verse 8, that if he continues to follow the law of God, not letting it depart from his mouth, this quest to lead Israel into the promised land will be successful. In the rest of chapter 1, verses 10 through 18, the 2.5 tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, which have been promised land on the east side of the Jordan River, what we often call the Transjordan or Transjordanian region, indicate they're going to follow after Joshua and fulfill the vows they made to Moses, that they would follow the rest of the people into the promised land, helping them inherit the land before returning to their land east of the Jordan. Chapter 2 of Joshua, with the people still on the east side of the Jordan, is a preparation for the invasion of the promised land, beginning with Jericho. To accomplish the purpose of conquest, Joshua sends 2 spies ahead into Jericho, and we have the famous story of the spies staying with Rahab, and Rahab letting the spies hide on her roof, and then sending those who are pursuing the spies away, so that the spies cannot be caught. And then we have Rahab putting the scarlet cord that she lets the spies down through the wall with, putting that in her window as a sign of the promise made by the spies that she and her family would not be killed, and a sign of Rahab's faith, as well as the covenantal aspect of the story as her family is spared in her house in the destruction of Jericho because of her faith. There is a collective covenantal aspect to her faith. Joshua chapter 3, all the people who are still on the east side of the Jordan River must now cross the Jordan River in an event that's quite similar to the crossing of the Red Sea. This time, rather than the outstretched staff of Moses, the priests carrying the ark touch the river with their feet and the waters divide. A monument will be placed in the middle of the Jordan River, commemorating the event. In Joshua chapter 4, the reverse monument takes place as 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan River are placed on the west side of the river, again serving as a monument, just as the stones in the Jordan River serve as a monument. Just as the Red Sea event confirmed Moses' leadership, the crossing of the Jordan River confirms Joshua's leadership in the eyes of Israel. It's also a great picture of baptism through the waters as the people emerge as a nation from the Red Sea, and they do the same here in Joshua chapter 4, emerging into the promised land as the nation of Israel, no longer slaves, but now the people of God entering into their inheritance. This change in status is confirmed in chapter 5, as in the first 9 verses Israel pauses to circumcise the people at Gilgal.
where God rolls away the disgrace of Egypt, hence the name Gilgal, a play on the Hebrew word for roll. Israel came out of the Jordan and reconfirms their status as God's people, since those who had come up out of Egypt 40 years earlier had not been circumcised. Any military leader will tell you it's a bad idea to circumcise your men before a battle, but again, this is a reminder that we are to follow God's means and not our own wisdom. Circumcision is a covenant renewal ceremony of sorts. It is appropriately followed then in verse 10 with Israel celebrating the Passover. With circumcision and the Passover, they have remembered the Exodus and God's faithfulness to the previous generation, but also God's promises to the next generation, his promises of faithfulness to them. The chapter ends with Joshua meeting the angel who's going to be leading the armies of the Lord. That angel tells Joshua that he needs to take off his shoes because Joshua is standing on holy ground, much like Moses on Mount Sinai was standing on holy ground at the burning bush. However, there's no message given to Joshua here in this chapter. Some assume that this is when Joshua received the instructions about walking around Jericho a certain number of times, but there's no indication that that's the case. Instead, the angel seems to be indicating to Joshua that all of the promised land is holy ground. Just like Mount Sinai, God's mountain, the land where Joshua is standing is west of the Jordan. He's in the promised land. It is all holy ground and should be treated accordingly. This is God's land. In Joshua chapter 6, we have the beginning of the conquest of the land by Israel attacking Jericho. Jericho is razed to the ground after the famous story of walking around and the walls falling down, and then the city is burned. Certain things that can pass through the fire can be taken and placed in the treasury of the Lord, but all other things are simply burned in the destruction of the city. This actually follows Deuteronomy chapter 13, verses 11 through 17, and the description of how you're supposed to deal with an Israelite town that refuses to turn from idolatry. This is how Jericho is treated. It is sacked, it is burned, it is not to be rebuilt. Unfortunately, in Joshua chapter 7, we find out that Israel violated the commandments of God, with Achan taking some of the devoted things he was not supposed to take. So, again, according to Deuteronomy 13, verse 10, Achan is treated as an idolater. He is stoned, he and all of his family, and then their corpses are burned. This also shows the covenantal aspects of the covenant with Israel. Ironically, it's the exact opposite of Rahab's experience. Those who are blessed by the covenant have their whole family blessed, like Rahab's family. But those who are cursed have their whole family cursed, as even Achan's children and his animals are cursed and purged from Israel. Once the troubler is purged from Israel, Israel in chapter 8 takes the city of Ai. In chapter 7, Israel had gone up to attack Ai, which is near Bethel, but they'd been unable to take Ai because of the sin of Achan, actually being routed and about 35 soldiers killed. So in chapter 8, we have Israel going back and actually accomplishing the task of conquering Ai, setting an ambush against the city and taking it. At the end of Joshua chapter 8, verses 28 through 35, we have the reading of the blessings and the curses from Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, blessings and curses which we as readers have just seen portrayed in the stories of Rahab and Achan. Those who follow God are promised, in the covenant of Moses, certain blessings, while those who disobey are cursed. One of those blessings, or curses, relates to military victory, which is an important part to remember in a book on military conquest, and a lesson Israel should have just learned in their defeat and then victory at Ai. The covenant, the law of Moses, is also written on a stone as a memorial against the people, probably just the 10 Commandments, probably not all the laws, but it's written on a whitewashed stone for posterity's sake so that Israel will remember to follow the words of God. Unfortunately, as is often the case in the Old Testament, chapter 9 relates Israel immediately forgetting everything they just learned and making a covenant with the Gibeonites without consulting God first. The Gibeonites pretend to be from far away. Israel falls for the ruse and makes a covenant, which sets up chapter 10 as Israel is forced to uphold the covenant that was foolishly made. But since they gave their word, they still have to follow what they said to the Gibeonites. The actions of the Israelites in Joshua 9 and 10 really serve to highlight the question, similar to what Jesus asks in Matthew chapter 7. If you who are evil and foolish even uphold a covenant, then how much more will the God of the universe, your heavenly Father, the God of Israel, how much more will he uphold his covenant? In this way, the book of Joshua is both an illustration and a confirmation of the covenant promises of God in the book of Deuteronomy.
In Joshua chapter 6, the city of Jericho was destroyed. In Joshua chapter 8, Ai was destroyed. And in Joshua chapter 10, Adoni-Zedek, the king of Jerusalem, and several others come to attack the Gibeonites. Since Israel had made a covenant with the Gibeonites, the Israelites were required to defend them. However, by the end of this battle, Adoni-Zedek and his comrades are all destroyed, all 5 kings having hidden a cave to flee the battle. This is the famous battle of Joshua asking God to have the sun stand still so that the enemies of Israel, and by extension, the enemy of the Gibeonites, might be defeated. And those enemies are defeated, and the 5 enemy kings are eventually brought out of the cave after the battle, with Joshua having the elders of Israel stand upon the throats of the 5 kings, after which all 5 kings are then executed. This concludes, at the end of chapter 10, this concludes the conquest of the south, geographically speaking, of the Promised Land. Joshua chapter 11 focuses more on the conquest of the northern part of the Promised Land, in quick fashion, before jumping in Joshua chapter 12 to a summary and a list of kings that are destroyed in Joshua chapters 6 through 12, and some that aren't recorded for us in terms of battles. Really, the book of Joshua, as exciting as it is with battles and such, is not as much interested in the details of the battles as in who fought for Israel. Joshua chapter 6, God made the walls fall down. Joshua chapter 7, Israel loses a battle because they disobeyed God. Joshua chapter 8, Israel has success because they're obedient to God. Joshua chapter 9, Israel ignores God with the Gibeonites, apparently having learned nothing from chapters 7 and 8. But in chapter 10, Joshua prays and God listens, fighting for Israel, killing more with hailstones from heaven than Joshua killed with the sword. The clear theme of the conquest is that it is God who fights for Israel. That's why the book of Joshua, in a book of conquest, has an entire chapter on covenant renewal ceremonies in chapter 5, and the blessings and curses of the covenant being read and written on a stone in Joshua chapter 8. Joshua is in many ways asking Israel if they have learned anything in their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. 40 years earlier, they did not believe that God would fight for them, so they did not enter the promised land. Now they're entering. Now will they believe that God will give them the promised land? Such a question will culminate with Joshua's famous statement at the end of the book of Joshua, "Who will you serve? As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Why? Because he's God. And clearly, as such, we are to serve him. And serving him is a key to obtaining and maintaining the promised land. Service of God is the key to the conquest, and really the key to the book of Joshua. Following after God in faith, believing that he is God, that we are to serve him, and that he will fight for Israel. One question concerning the conquest has to do with the cherem, the dedicating of people to destruction, as it's often translated in our English Bibles. We read in Joshua chapter 12, verses 19 and 20, that there was not a city that made peace with the people of Israel except the Gibeonites. It was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts that they should come against Israel in battle, in order that they should be devoted to destruction, cherem, that they should receive no mercy but be destroyed, just as the Lord commanded Moses. Goods in the book of Joshua are cheremed, dedicated to God by being put through the fire and put into God's treasury in the tabernacle, as we see in Jericho. People, on the other hand, are cheremed, devoted to destruction, by being killed. Some have tried to argue that Joshua and the Israelites did not really kill everybody, men, women, and children, but actually that is the case. They are indeed all killed, and they are all purified from the land, so that they will not lead Israel astray to follow after false gods, the gods of these other countries. It may sound violent, but remember these nations are not sweet innocent people. God specifically told Abraham about the sin of these Amorites some 400 years earlier. Within Joshua, the nations are called by 7 different names: Amorites, Girgashites, Canaanites, Jebusites, Perizzites, who may or may not have been related to the Hurrians, Hittites, and Hivites, who may be connected to Horites, but most famously included the Gibeonites. These are all cursed Canaanites, going all the way back to Noah's grandson. In the book of Joshua and elsewhere in the Old Testament, Amorite and Canaanite can be interchangeable terms used collectively of all these nations. At other times, the Amorites and the Canaanites referred to specific people groups and were separate. Regardless, they are part of the Amorites that are mentioned to Abraham and the Canaanites, Noah's grandson. They are cursed. They are part of the group of people that God intended to be killed for their sin, to be destroyed. So yes, as a cursed group of people, God intended to kill all of them. At least they were supposed to be killed. Unfortunately, Israel does not always follow through to devote the people to destruction, and the nations do lead Israel astray. So really, chapters 6 through 12 are not just about physical battles, but a theological battle, aiming to destroy any influence of foreign gods. The failure of Israel to do so is what leads to the failures in the book of Judges.
To say that the book of Joshua is about the land is an understatement. The book of Joshua is about how Israel enters into the land, about how they take the land, and about how they divide up the land. However, the division of the land is really an ideal, because the land that is divided up to each tribe is not actually taken within the book of Joshua. Unfortunately, it's not taken within the book of Judges either, but it's the ideal. It was what's supposed to be taken. Land that will not actually be taken until under the reign of King David and King Solomon, some 400 to 420 years in the future. Here in the book of Joshua, though, Joshua casts lots and lays out an allotment to each tribe, showing them what it is that they should endeavor to take. Some of the men to whom the tribes receive their allotment for actually take the town that they're supposed to take, such as Caleb taking Hebron. Others, like the tribe of Dan, fail miserably. But even so, within the book of Joshua, the land is laid out for them so that they know what they should take.
The second section of Joshua opens in chapter 13 and runs through chapter 22. The first 7 verses of chapter 13 form an introduction telling us what's going to take place in this section. The land is going to be parceled out. It's going to be allotted to the various tribes. The first section of Joshua, chapter 1 through 12, was the actual conquest of the land, the preparation for the conquest and the conquest itself. But now that the land has been taken, it needs to be divided. Although we're told in the first 7 verses of chapter 13 that some time has passed and still the land has not been taken. So allotment needs to take place, but also Joshua needs to light a fire under the Israelites to get them to do what they need to do. The first section of chapter 13 deals with the eastern tribes. You may remember from chapter 1 that the eastern tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh crossed over the Jordan River with the rest of Israel in order to help Israel take the land on the west side of the Jordan. But now that the conquest is complete, the eastern tribes are going to return home. However, there is a constant refrain, even when talking about the eastern tribes, that there is no inheritance for the tribe of Levi, because the Lord God Almighty is their inheritance. Chapter 14 begins with some administrative details. This is all going to take place through the casting of lots, with lots being cast for each tribe to determine what their land will be. Chapters 14 through 19 form the middle of this section. Chapter 14 begins with land for Caleb, and chapter 19 ends with land for Joshua. We have the two tribes here bookending this section. Chapter 15 is land for Judah, chapter 18 is land for Benjamin, and right in the middle we have land for Joseph. Chapter 19 ends up with land for everyone else that didn't get mentioned in chapters 14 through 18. But this is a clue to us that there is a sort of chiasm going on here. There is a reflexive element to this section. We begin in chapter 14 with the land for one of the faithful spies. We end in chapter 19 with land for the other faithful spy, bookending this section. And yet outside of this, the macro structure of this section shows us that there's reflexive chiasm as well, because we began talking about the eastern tribes, not Levi, and then the administrative detail of casting lots. We're going to finish up in chapter 20 with more administrative detail with the cities of refuge, and land for Levi in chapter 21. They actually will receive an inheritance. Even though God is their inheritance, they will receive cities. And the focus here is comparative to the not Levi of chapter 13, only now in 21 it is Levi that's getting land. And then we finish in chapter 22 with the eastern tribes, having returned home, now building a monument to remind those tribes on the western side of the Jordan River that the tribes on the eastern side of the Jordan River are part of Israel too. They don't want to be forgotten. They are now officially part of the Promised Land. And so these chapters, chapter 13 through 22, form a complete section, a reflexive chiastic section, telling us about the actual division of the land, how each tribe ends up with the land that's allotted to it, giving us the geographical descriptions and barriers of each, telling us how Caleb ended up with Hebron, how Joshua ended up with the land that he wished for, how we have administrative details of cities of refuge, and how this all took place through lots, and of course the description of Levi and the eastern tribes. From start to finish, the passage repeats itself. Chapter 13 through chapter 22, all rotating around the central section of chapters 16 and 17 in land for Joseph, leading up to those chapters and leading away from those chapters in a chiastic structure. Joshua chapter 21 ends with a summary statement that is very similar to the end of the southern conquest in Joshua chapter 10 and the end of the northern conquest at the end of Joshua chapter 11, and the summary chapter of Joshua chapter 12, summarizing up the entire conquest. Here we are at Joshua chapter 21 as the land has been allotted, and now there is a conclusion. The allotment is over, the conquest is over. Everything is done. Verse 44, the Lord gave rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. And yet, on the other hand, this passage causes us pause because we know from the book of Judges that Israel has not taken all the land that it's supposed to take, and to much degree will not take all that land until the time of David. So how can God say that he's given them rest? Well, Joshua chapter 21 is not simply a pie-in-the-sky conclusion. It is accurate. God has indeed given Israel rest. However, just because Israel has not done what Israel is supposed to do, it doesn't take away from the fact that God has done what he promised to do, and what God promises that he will continue to do if Israel will trust him. This is where the part of Judges comes in. Israel does not trust God to take the promised land that has been allotted to them. And yet all the land has indeed been allotted. They do live in the land. None of their enemies have withstood them. And so far, none of the good promises that God made to the house of Israel has failed. It has all come to pass. Joshua chapter 21, then, is an accurate summary of what has taken place in the book of Joshua. Even though we know the rest of the story, and even though we know that there is much failure to come in the book of Judges, the focus in Joshua chapter 21 is on the faithfulness of God, on the faithfulness of his promises. Even after all these years, God has done what he said. Israel is in the land, and Israel has rest. However, it will be incumbent upon them to continue to follow after God to maintain that rest and to complete the conquest of the promised land.
One final aspect to note in the book of Joshua is that the book of Joshua ends with a final warning, as Joshua is declaring to Israel what the covenant says they are supposed to do in the land, and reminding them of the fact that God is a holy God and he does not take rebellion lightly. This is a final warning, a summary of the book of Deuteronomy, bringing it forward prior to the book of Judges. Again, that extra reminder to the people, now that they have entered into the promised land, they are not simply receiving Moses' last words on the plains of Moab. Now they are receiving Joshua's last words within the promised land, gathered at Mizpah, as the people have conquered the land and are at rest, as it were. Again, because of the fact that the land ideal has not been accomplished, there is much work left to be done, and yet at the same time, Joshua realizes that the bulk of it is done. It is now up to the particular tribes to complete the job that has been begun by the armies of Israel. Thus, Joshua is giving them a final warning about what is going to happen after he is gone. Unfortunately, it's as though Joshua is prophetically speaking of what's going to happen in the book of Judges, because as soon as Joshua dies in Judges chapter 1, bad things begin to happen. The Israelites begin to apostatize, they begin to go away from God, they begin to ignore the words of the covenant that Joshua reminds them of at the end of Joshua. So as Joshua presents that bridge, that transition, it's a transition of moving from outside the land to in the land, of moving from an era of Moses and Joshua to the era of the judges and the priests and the prophets having the preeminent position of leadership in Israel, of having not a central formalized government in Joshua, but instead having a tribal government within their own particular tribes and their own particular lands. It's a transition from having no land to being given land that they now have to take, and it's a transition from the covenant being given for the second time in Deuteronomy to now being reiterated prior to entering into the book of Judges.
Joshua then is an important book because of these concluding themes. Joshua has presented to us the notions of the cherem, it has presented to us the ideal of the land, and it has given us final warnings. setting the stage for the rest of the historical books, especially the book of Judges, as the book of Judges and beyond will build upon the themes of the book of Joshua, building upon the themes of Deuteronomy, but also upon these themes of Joshua as it relates specifically to the land, the behavior within the land, and the final warnings of Joshua to the people.
The book of Joshua is the end of the era of Joshua, so that the book of Judges opens in verse 1 with a reminder that Joshua has died. Or, as Victor Hamilton says, there was no Joshua. Then in chapters 3 through 16, we have the Judges. And then in chapters 17 through 21, we have a repeated refrain. Instead of no Joshua, now we have no king. So the chapters 1 through 3 unpack the impact that it makes in Israel of not having Joshua, not having his godly leadership. And chapters 17 through 21 bookend the book of Judges by showing us the spiritual impact made of having no king, that there is this vacuum of leadership. No one is actually taking over in Israel to lead it in a godly direction. Of course, that anticipates King David in 1 Samuel chapter 17 and following. But still, the idea here is being presented that no Joshua is very similar to no king, and that the judge period in the middle is somewhat unique. There were judges, and they worked for a time, but the impact of the time of no Joshua really led to disaster in the time of no judges, which gave this intense longing then in chapters 17 through 21 for a king that would be filled later. Let's take a moment to dig a little deeper into the book of Judges and the structure, looking first at that section of 1:1 through chapter 3, verse 6, the era of there was no Joshua in those days. Of course, that's not what the text says. I'm borrowing the language at the end of the book. There was no king in those days. But the overall flavor of this first section does seem to be implying that that's the point. This is what happened when Joshua was gone. So here in the first section, verse 1 of chapter 1, really through verse 5 of chapter 2, we see that Joshua is gone, and the tribe of Judah responds by praying to God who should go up and attack the Canaanites. And God says the tribe of Judah should go up. This language continues to build as the tribe of Judah goes up, as the tribes beyond Judah in verses 21 and following of chapter 1 do not go up. And eventually in chapter 2, where God comes up and says to the Israelites, you didn't go up as you were supposed to. Basically, there is an increase of this idea of going up and who's doing the going up. We see this at the end of the book of Judges as well, as again they pray who should go up. And again God says Judah, but this time Judah gets defeated by the Benjaminites, so that 40,000 men from Judah die in that first attack, that first battle. Again, showing the bookends, as it were. Here in chapter 1, there's supposed to be a cherem, a devoting to destruction of the people of these other nations that are going to live and are living within the borders of Israel. And yet at the end, when they pray who should go up, it's going up against the Benjaminites, against a tribe of Israel. They're chereming, devoting to destruction, a tribe within Israel, rather than nations within Israel. Judah here, though, however, seems to do what they're supposed to do, and even when they don't, at the end of this first section, in verses 19, 20, and 21 of Judges chapter 1, the writer of Judges almost gives an excuse or a concession to their failure to go up and take the land, almost in a common sense, well, they had chariots, so of course they didn't go up, which really is just an excuse, because Israel should have gone up and still taken that land, even though there were chariots. And yet still these first 20 or so verses are very pro-Judah. They're very much in favor of what Judah has done. But then when we get to the rest of the chapter, chapter 1, 21 and following, we realize that the writer is very negative towards the other tribes, that the other tribes have not done what they're supposed to do, and so there are a lot of people left in Israel who shouldn't be there, which then causes God to respond in chapter 2, verse 5 by pointing out the consequences. Because you did not go up and conquer the land, I'm not going to drive them out. I'm not going to deliver them from you. You did not drive them out, so I'm not going to drive them out. They're going to continue to plague you for years to come. Chapter 2, verse 6 through chapter 3, verse 6, this second section of our first division, chapter 1, 1 through 3, 6, know Joshua, has a harsher tone to it. We're told at the beginning of this section that a generation arises which did not know God. This is certainly upon the shoulders of the previous generation that didn't teach their children correctly. But there's also a connection made by Victor Hamilton between this and Pharaoh not knowing Joseph. The Pharaoh that arose could have known Joseph, could have read the documents and known all that Joseph did, but because of some of the prevailing changes in Egypt at the time, after the rule of the Hyksos kings, the Canaanite Amorite kings that took over northern Egypt, Pharaoh doesn't want to know a non-Egyptian. He doesn't want to know Joseph, and he's afraid of the Israelites. The same is true here. It's not just that the Israelites don't know God and that they're lacking knowledge from their parents. This is also a spiritual statement. They do not want to know God. They don't want to have anything to do with him. The writer here borrows still from Joshua, although now from Joshua 24, as a flashback to the decline of Joshua and Joshua dying. Instead, this writer, or this section of Judges, perhaps written by the same writer, draws more from the book of Deuteronomy, applying the book of Deuteronomy and the law of God to the Israelites here in the book of Judges, to show that they are not doing what they were required by God to do. They don't know him and they don't know his law. They don't desire him and they don't desire to follow after his law. This section is also more general in the sense that not as many town names are mentioned. Instead, it seems to be giving just a general overview of the condition of Israel at the time, and when it does, it is more harshly critical. In the first section, chapter 1, 1 through 2, 5, we were able to read between the lines and see that Israel did not do what they were supposed to do. Here in this section, the narrator is willing to insert narrative comment and just flat out say, Israel sinned, Israel did not do what they were supposed to do, rather than putting those words in the mouth of God in chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, as in the previous section. Instead, the writer feels free to insert their own opinion, talking about how worthless Israel was at this time and what they failed to do. Because of this, we're left with several nations living in Israel at the time. God says that he left them there to test Israel, to make sure that their hearts would follow fully after him. They're also there to teach Israel war, because now a generation is living in the promised land that doesn't know war. And they're also there as a direct consequence of their lack of willingness to drive out the enemies of God, their poor stewardship of the land, which is really a sad testimony. God here is giving the nations rest, the passage says, giving the nations rest from the destructive power of the Israelites. The exact opposite of reading that God gave rest to David from all of his enemies all around, securing his throne. Here it's God securing the nations, saying, fine, if my people don't want to take the promised land, I'm not going to drive you out either. A great reversal of that promise where God said, if you fight and drive them out, I'll drive them out before you. Now God is pouring out his judgment in this particular instance upon Israel, saying they're always going to be there now. These nations will always lead you astray. This is really where Israel's spiritual problems start, at least as it relates to the other nations, but really it started even earlier, as Israel demonstrated that they didn't want to know God. They could have driven some of these nations out because they forced them to serve as slave labor, but they simply choose not to. They choose not to drive the nations out, but to keep them around, perhaps to do slave labor, but also because they were interested in having them as part of their nation, which again, as we discussed last time, is just poor stewardship of the land of God. This was God's land. It was supposed to be taken for God, not given to a foreigner, not given to other people. And yet Israel is content to do that. They're content to despise God and not be good stewards of the land, which is part of why God then punishes them and says, fine, if you don't want to take it, I'll leave them here, and they will continue to be a snare for you. As soon as we start the book of Judges, we have a problem, because in the book of Judges, we have a name. It's the name that is given to the book of the Bible, Judges. Obviously, the book then is about judges. But what exactly is a judge? How do we define a judge? At least in English, we say a judge is a person who judges. But is that exactly what is meant in the book of Judges? In Judges chapter 2, verses 16 through 18, we read that the Lord raised up judges, shophatim, using the participle of shaphat, to judge, which delivered them out of the hands of those that spoiled them. Whenever the Lord raised up judges, shophatim, for them, the Lord was with the judge, shophet, and he saved them from the hand of the enemies all the days of the judge, shophet. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groanings because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. This is actually the only place inside the book of Judges where the noun, hashophet, is actually used to refer to the judges. We're told from here on out that they judged, shaphat, but we aren't told that they are judges. The only other person in the book of Judges that's called a judge later on is actually God himself, that God is the judge of all the earth. But this is where the name of the book of Judges comes from, hashophet, the judge. Again, we have to ask ourselves, what does that mean? Would we understand it the same way that the ancient Israelites would have understood it? That's really the question that faces us as we begin this book. We're talking about judges, but what's a judge? One of the elements in the book of Judges that makes the idea of a judge more difficult to define is the fact that judges don't only appear in the book of Judges. Instead, in Exodus chapter 18, we read that Moses was advised by his father-in-law Jethro to appoint under judges who would judge Israel so that Moses doesn't have to hear every case. Moses appoints judges over tens, 20s, 50s, hundreds so that they can hear the lesser cases, and he only has to hear the more difficult cases. In this sense, a judge functions very similar to our American judges, where a judge is actually judging, hearing a case, judging, making a decision. In Numbers chapter 25, though, Moses gives almost a military function to the judges, or more specifically, an executioner role to the judges. Moses says to the judges of Israel, "Each of you kill those of his men who have yoked themselves to Baal of Peor." Balaam, you may remember, was supposed to curse the Israelites, fails miserably, and ends up blessing them. So he suggests to the king of Moab, the king of the Midianites, that instead of cursing them, he should actually lead them into idolatry, and God will curse the Israelites, which is what happens. A plague breaks out among the Israelites, and Moses here advises them that they need to go around and kill each of the people that have yoked themselves to the god of Peor, to Baal. Eventually, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, will kill two prominent people, one an Israelite and one a chieftain's daughter of the Moabite Midianite nation, and that will end the plague. So here we see a judge not just serving as judge and making a decision, but really serving as judge and executioner. In Deuteronomy 16, verse 18, and chapter 17, verse 9, we see a command to appoint judges in every town that the Lord your God has given you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. And you shall come to the Levitical priests, and to the judge who is in office in those days, suggesting that there is only one, and you shall consult them, and they shall declare to you the decision. Here in this passage, we have Levites connected with the office of judge, but we also have local judges that serve in tribes and in different towns. All of which suggests that while we have a primary judge in the book of Judges who is highlighted and his story is told, it's possible that there are multiple judges at any given time within Israel, and that the writer of the book of Judges has just selected one major, or in some cases one minor judge, to mention, and to deal with their particular story as it relates to his overall emphasis within the book of Judges. It's possible that what we're reading is not an exhaustive account of all the judges, but again, just a highlighting of particular judges to accomplish the point that the writer of Judges wishes to accomplish, as he writes his book about the decline of the Israelites during this period known as the time of the Judges. The judges are acting as judge and in many ways acting as executioner, but they are appointed and perhaps working alongside the Levites and the priests. In fact, the text seems to be very silent on the idea of the Levites and the priests. The first priest that we hear mentioned as a judge is actually Eli in the book of 1 Samuel, all of which suggests that maybe the Levites and the priests and the elders in each town were supposed to be judges, but they weren't. They failed to do what they were supposed to do, which is well in keeping with the book of Judges. We have this major gap in leadership within the book of Judges, almost saying we have a gap in who's supposed to be judge in Israel. That the fact that God had to raise up a judge is because all the other judges were not doing their job. Of course, that still doesn't answer the question of what exactly a judge does. Obviously, since judge comes from the verb shafat, we would expect that a judge would shafat, that he would judge. After all, he's called a shofet or the shofatim, either the judge or judges. So a judge is supposed to judge. But then we read in the very first account of a judge, Othniel, in Judges chapter 3, that the Spirit of the Lord was upon him, and he judged Israel. We think to ourselves, excellent, he is the judge, he is the one who's making the decisions. But then we have this curious phrase, he went out to war. And we begin to question, wait a minute, I thought a judge was just a judge. At least in our understanding of judges, judges make decisions. Judges are not the military. In fact, even in our military, the judges who are in the military and serve in the Judge Advocate General's office do not fight. They are non-combatants. They are judges. Their duty is only to judge. And yet here we see the judging involving a military status. We read also in Judges chapter 10 that after Abimelech, there arose to save Israel Tola, the son of Puah, son of Dodo, a man of Issachar, lived at Shamir in the hill country of Ephraim. He judged Israel 23 years. Again, is this him making decisions? Is he militarily leading Israel? What exactly was he doing? We see this repetition of he judged with Jair in chapter 10 verse 3, Jephthah in chapter 12 verse 7, Ibzan in chapter 12 verse 8, Elon in chapter 12 verse 11, Abdon in chapter 12 verse 13, and finally with Samson in chapter 16 verse 31. He judged. Deborah was not actually said to have judged. Instead, it says she was judging. It's one of the only times that a feminine participle is used for the word shafat in the book of Judges, not specifying that she judged, but simply saying that she was judging at that time, which again we'll discuss in class in a few weeks. So again, we're left with this question of what does it mean to shafat? Is it just an issue of mishpat, of pursuing justice or judgment? Is it just making decisions? Or is there a military aspect to it? Because every single one of these stories takes place when Israel is being oppressed by the nations. And Israel needs deliverance, and they cry out to God, and God raises up not a warrior, but a judge. And he calls him a judge. And yet, the judge is a warrior. So what exactly is a judge? There is another verb that is used in connection to the duties of a judge, besides shafat, and that's yasha, deliverance, save. It's the word from which we get the name Joshua, Yeshua, or, as I'm sure you've noticed, in the New Testament, Jesus, which is why when the angel tells Joseph to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins, he's referencing back to this verb, yasha, deliverance, save, Yeshua, Jesus. We're told numerous times in the book of Judges that the Lord raised up judges which, yasha, delivered them out of the hands of those who spoiled them. Chapter 2, verse 16. We see this first with Othniel in chapter 3, verse 9. The Lord raised up a deliverer, yasha, although a participial form, for the people of Israel who saved them, verb form, Othniel. Othniel was the savior, the deliverer of Israel. We see this repeated again and again and again, that the Lord raised up for them a deliverer. Chapter 3, verse 15 with Ehud. Chapter 3, verse 31, Shamgar. Chapter 6, verse 14, Gideon. Tola in chapter 10, Samson in chapter 13, a deliverer. In fact, the word deliverer or deliverer occurs more times in the book of Judges than even the word judge or judging or judges. So why don't we just call these people simply saviors? Well, again, I think we're left with the understanding that a judge is not just somebody who sits behind a bench and bangs a gavel, and yet at the same time, a judge is not just somebody who is a warrior in Israel. Although we might get that idea from the pages of Judges, that a judge is simply someone who leads the armies of God, similar to Joshua.
If we push the military side of a judge too far, we almost end up with a picture of Judge Dredd from the old comic book or from the cheesy 1995 movie with Sylvester Stallone, as he runs around as judge, jury, and executioner saying, "I am the law." The judge in the book of Judges is a military deliverer, and yet on the other hand, he functions as more than simply a military deliverer. He is a tribal leader. And that's perhaps the best way to examine the judges in the book of Judges, beginning with military deliverance, but then leading the people as a tribal leader for the rest of their life. That's why we find out that even Samson judged the people for over 20 years. Yes, he did military deliverance, as did Gideon and others, but he also apparently had a judicial function in terms of making decisions and providing leadership. Keep in mind that whenever we talk about Gideon as a judge, we also have to talk about Samuel and Eli as judges, balancing out that idea of military leadership. Involved in the military? Absolutely. We see that with Samuel leading the people, but we also see Samuel judging the people and giving decisions. So even though Judges emphasizes that military component, that doesn't mean it's the only component.
So, who exactly are the judges in the book of Judges? Well, again, I suggested back earlier in this lecture that there are numerous judges in Israel, and that what we have in the book of Judges is a highlighting of 11 judges. I'll get to why the author of Judges does this in just a few moments. But there are 11 that we have mentioned here in the book of Judges. I'll explain some of the ones that are left out in just a moment. But 11 starting with Othniel and going all the way through Samson. 11 judges. It's likely as you look at this list of judges that you don't recognize all the names, and that's normal because a lot of these names are what we call minor judges. Oftentimes we'll put Othniel in with the list of major judges because he takes up more than a verse, which is true of Shamgar, Tola, Jer, Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon, where they are barely mentioned other than a verse or two. Othniel is explained in a few more verses, but he still doesn't receive that many, which is why I have not highlighted him here. These four, Ehud, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson, receive chapters describing the work that they did. Thus, they're major judges. This is probably not a distinction that the Israelites would have had. For them, they were just judges. But at least for our understanding, we understand minor judges and major judges. Understanding it simply based on the amount of text that is donated or given to that particular judge's story. It's not meant to highlight their work and how significant their work was, or how insignificant their work was, or how insignificant of a tribe they came from. It's just simply meant to highlight the fact that certain judges of the 11 have more information given to them than others.
I've already offered the thought that this list of judges is not necessarily exhaustive, because it is possible that there are other judges in Israel at the time of the judges. We'll talk in a few slides another reason why that is perhaps the case, since these judges seem to have served geographically in particular areas of Israel. But we also know that there are judges not on this list from other books of the Bible, in addition to those mentioned in the Levitical setting in book of Deuteronomy and Leviticus. We know that Eli, Samuel, and Samuel's sons are all mentioned in 1 Samuel as being judges, and yet they don't occur in the book of Judges at all. We also have the interesting question of Barak and Deborah. Deborah is said to be giving the judgment at that time, or judging Israel at that time. The text seems to be very specific, that only at that time, at that particular moment, was she judging Israel. The text seems to go out of its way to make it clear that she is a prophetess and she is not a judge. And yet, on the other hand, Barak is not really referred to as a judge either, although he is the military deliverer within the passage. So you would expect him to be labeled as the judge, and yet that is not the case. Instead, the closest that we ever get to seeing Barak listed as a judge is later on in the book of Hebrews, where in the book of Hebrews we read, "What more should I say? For time would fail to tell me of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah." There, the writer of Hebrews seems to think that Barak is a man of faith, which, if you've read the book of Judges and Judges chapter 4 through 6, is somewhat laughable. But Barak is put alongside Gideon, another man whose faith is questionable, and Samson and Jephthah, all of whom are questionable in their faith, but all of whom served as judges. And so the writer of Hebrews seems to think that Barak is a judge. But as for the book of Judges itself, it never labels him as such. Nor does it label Abimelech, the son of Gideon, as a judge. And yet we read in chapter 10, verse 1, that after Abimelech there arose to defend Israel Tola the son of Puah, the son of Dodo, a man of Issachar. It seems to present Tola as the subsequent judge after Abimelech, even though it never calls Abimelech a judge. Abimelech is a worthless leader. He wants to be king, not just judge, and tries to act as such, but does a terrible job of it. And so the text seems to avoid labeling him as judge. It would have been really convenient to have the book of Judges have 12 judges, but instead we have 11, although if we add in Eli and Samuel, we get 13, plus Samuel's sons would be 15, and then we're left with the question of Deborah, Barak, and Abimelech, so we may have more than 15. But at least within the book of Judges, there are 11 primary judges that are labeled as judges, plus the story of Barak and Abimelech. One of the issues in the interpretation of the book of Judges has to do with geography and chronology. And by chronology, I mean the amount of time that takes place in the book of Judges. We have, in the words of Solomon, an indication that it's been 480 years since Israel came out of Egypt, up through the building of the temple. Jephthah says that it's been 300 years since Israel came out of Egypt, until his day. Both of these give us a ballpark figure of the amount of time that takes place in the period of the Judges. However, if we simply add up all the time references in the book of Judges to the number of years that these 11 judges were in service, we find out that there is more than the amount of time that is indicated by either Solomon or Jephthah. So what are we supposed to do? Well, the leading theory is that these different judges all served in different geographical areas, and that it is possible that some of these judges were actually overlapping one another, even though they were in different areas of Israel, serving at the same time. For instance, Jephthah and Samson are often suggested to have been serving at the same time, and Deborah in her song actually mentions that it takes place in the days of Shamgar, again giving further credence to the idea that there is an overlap. So they are serving in geographically different areas of Israel, and yet they may be serving at the same time. So that what we have here is not 11 judges, one serving right after the other, but 11 judges with some overlap. It is possible as we examine the book of Judges that not only do several of the judges possibly overlap chronologically, it's also possible that they don't necessarily go in chronological order. Instead, they may be ordered theologically. Now, as we glance at the judges, it appears that they go in order, but it also appears that they occur one after the other, which again, we've already said may not be the case. The writer of Judges has positioned his book to make a theological point and to get the book to go downhill by the time we reach the end of the book. So that at the end of the book, as we have the craziness with the Benjaminites and Gibeah, and the craziness leading up to the arrival of Saul and King David in 1 Samuel, we also have the mention of Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, telling us that we're only one or two generations removed from Aaron. We're only one or two generations past Joshua. We're not at the end of the period of the Judges chronologically, even though that's how the writer of Judges has set up his book. And so it's possible that the movement from Othniel and Judah is deliberately going downhill until we get to Samson and the tribe of Dan. Dan, who couldn't even take its own territory and ends up in both the southwest and the north. Dan, who, as we see in the last couple chapters, ends up taking a false idol from Micah on their travels to the north and setting up their own false religion and false tabernacle. We begin with Othniel, who has a noble wife, the daughter of Caleb. We finish with Samson, who doesn't even have an Israelite wife, but a foreign girlfriend who is not loyal. We have Deborah near the beginning of the book of Judges. We have Delilah at the end. So we have really gone downhill until we reach those final chapters of the book, where we're told that everyone did what was right in their own eyes. The writer of Judges seems to have set up the cycles so that each cycle, much like a roller coaster, doesn't return to the same height from which it left. Instead, it sinks lower and lower.
In chapter 3, verse 7, we move into the actual description of the stories of the 11 judges, plus the stories of Abimelech and Deborah and Barak. There is a macro form or a motif description of these particular 11 judges. Some of these elements show up also in the stories of Deborah, not in the stories of Abimelech. We're told a series of events that serve as a cycle. Othniel is the first judge, the prototypical judge in many ways, and so his story contains all of these elements, whereas the other judges will vary in the details that are given. The minor judges, those six, also often include a notice of the number of children that they had and even where they're buried. Although there is a similarity between the last three minor judges and the last three major judges, as they contain the major parts of the motif. But we also see a decline then in these last three judges, that the last three minor judges are also going downhill, just like the last three major judges, which is why occasionally there's no mention of peace reigning after the time of the disappearance of that minor judge. So, what exactly is the formula? Well, we're told first that Israel did evil in the eyes of God. This occurs with six different judges, the first step in the cycle. Plus, it's found in the introductory materials in chapter 1:1 through chapter 3, verse 6. We're told that they forgot their God. Two judge stories mention this, although it occurs 5 times within those two judge stories, plus the introductory materials. God's anger burned against the people of Israel. That's mentioned with two different of the judges, plus the introductory materials. God then responded by selling them or giving them over into the hands of somebody. This occurs with 4 judges plus the introduction. And twice we're told with 2 different judges how long they served and were subject to that foreign power until God raises up a judge, which is a phrase that occurs 5 times plus the introduction. The Spirit of God comes upon that particular leader and they deliver Israel. The Spirit coming is mentioned 4 times. And we're told that they therefore became a judge and went to war, which is a story that occurs 7 times within the narratives of the judges. And the Lord gave the enemy power into the hands of the judge. That occurs 5 times. And there is a resulting peace. That's mentioned 4 times. And we're told that they followed Israel all the days of that particular judge until that judge died. That particular refrain occurs in every single one of the judges, except for Shamgar. He's pretty short. And in the narrative concerning Deborah, as though to make a point that she's not serving as judge until she died. She's only judge at that one particular moment in time, judging rather than being the judge. Again, this motif occurs in varying degree with every judge, some pieces being left out, and at least with the minor judges in the reference to burial place and the number of children, some information
Despite
being
the
added in.
variations of the formula and the description of the various judges, both major judges and minor judges, even the minor judges demonstrates that there is a downhill trajectory to the book. We begin in chapter 3 with the first minor judge. After him was Shamgar, the son of Anath, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad. He also saved Israel. There's very little information that's given about Shamgar, other than that he existed and he killed Philistines. After him we have Tola. Tola was actually after Abimelech, but Tola is the next minor judge. He was the son of Pua, the son of Dodo, a man of Issachar, and he lived in the hill country of Ephraim. It's curious that he lived in the hill country of Ephraim since he was from Issachar, which is a clue that something is going on here that is a little odd. What's more important is that he judged Israel 23 years. The next minor judge is Jair the Gileadite. He judges Israel for 22 years, so a year shorter than Tola. He had 30 sons on 30 donkeys and 30 cities. We're a little confused as to why this detail is given, partly because it makes Jair seem more like a king than a judge. Especially when we come to Ibzan of Bethlehem, we're not told what tribe he's a part of. Bethlehem is in Judah or Benjamin, and it's possible that his tribe is not mentioned because, again, the writer of Judges is trying to go downhill from Judah down to Dan, and if he throws Judah in the middle, it messes all that up. He's only given in terms of the city. He has 30 sons, but now also 30 daughters, who he married outside the clan, which was not supposed to be done, and 30 daughters he brought in from outside for his sons, which was not supposed to be done. And he only judges Israel 7 years. So we've gone downhill from 22 years to 7 years, We've gone more crazy from 30 sons to 30 sons and 30 daughters, not 30 donkeys, but 30 daughters. After him, Elon the Zebulunite in chapter 12 judges Israel. He reigns slightly longer than Ibzan, 10 years instead of 7 years. He dies and he's buried in the land of Zebulun. There's no other information that's given about him. But then the final minor judge, Abdon, he is the son of Hillel, the Pirathonite. He has 40 sons and 30 grandsons and rides on 70 donkeys. So we've increased from 30 sons and 30 donkeys to 30 sons and 30 daughters to 40 sons, 30 grandsons, 70 donkeys. And the time has gone down again, 8 years. And then when he's buried, we're told that he's buried in the land of Ephraim in the hill country of the Amalekites. It's one thing to be buried in the land of Ephraim when you're not from Ephraim. That's crazy. But now he's being buried in a land that doesn't even belong to Israel. Even in the minor judges, we see this downhill trajectory, where we start great with Shamgar, and we go downhill all the way to somebody who's buried in the land of the Amalekites. A quick note about Shamgar. Some people have suggested that because there are 4 letters in his name, SH, which would be Shin, Mem, Gimel, Resh, SH, M, G, and R, the 4 consonants there, that he was not an Israelite, because of the fact that Israelites typically have 3 consonants in their name. However, this is a bit of a stretch. It's possible that he just simply has a foreign name, not that he was actually a foreigner. He saves Israel there in verse 31 of chapter 3. He is one of the only minor judges to have saved Israel. The rest of them judge Israel, but he actually saves Israel. Until we get all the way down to Abdon in chapter 12, and we find out that Abdon seems to be making himself king. Seems to be more interested himself than in saving Israel. A downhill trajectory.
After Othniel, we have Ehud, who arises as judge, a left-handed Benjaminite. This is significant for a number of different reasons. Some people have suggested that it's significant because he could keep his sword on his right hand thigh and then pull out the sword with his left hand and unsuspectingly kill the king. However, there's nothing in the text that suggests that it's the fact that he has his sword on his right thigh that allows him to be able to kill the king or to carry the sword into the king's presence, although that's often the Sunday school explanation. What's more important is the fact that he's a left-handed Benjaminite. We will see left-handed Benjaminites at the end of the book of Judges, Judges chapter 20, when we read about 700 chosen men of Benjamin who are all left-handed and who can sling a stone with a sling at a hair and not miss, according to chapter 20, verse 16. So this is, again, the book ending of the book of Judges, where we started with Judah in Othniel and a great judge going all the way downhill to Samson, and here starting with a Benjaminite who's left-handed, and we will go all the way down to a left-handed Benjaminite in chapter 20 as Israel is attempting to devote to destruction the tribe of Benjamin. We've gone from devoting to destruction the Moabites to devoting to destruction God's people, the Israelites. So this is a significant decline in Israel from this high point down to that low point. Ehud will come and will fight against Eglon. He will kill him in the upper chamber by telling him that he's a secret message for him and then stabbing him. Famously, the sword goes into his belly and the fat closes over it, and it's said that the dung comes out. This is also probably a reference to the fact that the servants of Eglon seem to think that he's relieving himself, not in the sense of taking a nap. More than likely, they think he's on the throne. And by on the throne, I don't mean a golden throne. I mean the porcelain throne, although it's probably not porcelain in those days. But they seem to think that he's using the restroom, that he's using the bathroom, and they don't want to interrupt because that would just be impolite. What they don't know is that he's dead, and by the time they figure it out, Ehud is long gone. He goes and he summons the men of the hill country of Ephraim. Odd, because he's a Benjaminite. You would think that he would call out the men of Benjamin, and yet calling out the men of the hill country of Ephraim is fairly common. It appears that the men of the hill country of Ephraim were mighty warriors. The hill country of Ephraim will play a significant part in the book of Judges. Deborah is from the hill country of Ephraim, as are several other of the judges Gideon seems to be hiding in the hill country of Ephraim in Judges chapter 6. We see the men of the hill country of Ephraim called out after Gideon and after Jephthah to fight. And we see some disagreement between Gideon and Jephthah and the men of the hill country of Ephraim because of the scenario of what takes place when they are called out to fight. This will again be repeated again and again, that the men of the hill country of Ephraim are what are called out to fight, presumably because they're mighty warriors, and also because, as Jacob foretold in Genesis 48 and 49, the people of Ephraim would be mighty, so that by the time we get to the prophets, it is common to refer to the entire northern kingdom as Ephraim. The next judge, if we want to use that term, is Barak. Barak is fairly interesting in that he's never really called a judge. There's one passage in 1 Samuel that refers to Barak as a judge. However, that appears to be a textual variant, and it seems to be that Abdon is the judge that's being mentioned in 1 Samuel, and not Barak. We're also told that the one who is doing the judging, at least in the particular circumstance that we find her in, is Deborah. However, as we will discuss in class, Deborah is not presented as a judge. She's never referred to as a judge, and while she's judging, she is judging at that time. However, in the book of Judges, at that time almost always refers to a punctiliar sense of time, not an ongoing, as in she in that general time frame was being a judge, but at that particular moment she was giving a judgment in response to the particular threat that exists there in Israel at the time. Deborah really seems to be a mark upon Barak, the fact that Barak is chicken and won't go to battle without her. She raises up Barak and sends him out to fight, but she does so by saying, "Has the Lord not commanded you?" As if to say, you've already been told to do this and you're ignoring him. In the end, Barak will receive no glory from his destruction of the enemies of God. Instead, Jael will be the one who will drive the pent stake through the head of Sisera. You remember that Jael is a Kenite. We had the Kenites seemingly randomly mentioned back in chapter 1. Now we begin to understand why. We needed to know who the Kenites were so that when we came to Jael, we'd understand why she was a non-Jew in the technical sense, a non-Israelite, and yet was still living in the region. It also explains why the Kenites had a relationship with Sisera and with the enemies of God in that particular circumstance. Really, this whole story seems to be a mark on the book of Judges as a whole and not just on Barak. For instance, when we look at the list, we see that there are 12 judges, but we're missing one if we take out Barak, and then we're left with 11. I personally think that the author of the book of Judges does this on purpose, that he knows that you expect 12 because we have 12 tribes, and yet he pulls one out to emphasize how crazy and messed up the book of Judges is, and how crazy and messed up Barak is, that he was supposed to be the 12th judge, but he doesn't do it. Instead, the prophetess has to come along and has to serve as the one giving the judgment. The land does have peace after the events of Barak and Deborah's actions against the enemies of God, but for whatever reason, we don't really consider them judges, although we'll discuss this further in class as to whether or not we should. Again, as has already been mentioned in class, it's difficult to know. Did the author assume that you would recognize Barak as the 12th judge, or did he assume that you would recognize him as the 12th judge, so he deliberately left him out, so that you would see that there are only 11? Another interesting fact that takes place in this particular story is the fact that Barak and the events of Deborah seem to take place during the reign of Shamgar as a judge. Because when Deborah sings her song in Judges chapter 5, she refers to it taking place in the days of Shamgar, as though there is some overlap. This is the only time that we see an explicit reference to an overlap in the book of Judges. We also have Deborah's song, which is considered by even secular scholars as one of the oldest discussions of a theophany of God as he comes to the rescue of Israel in the first part of her poem. She's really recapturing all of the events that take place in chapter 4, but then she is putting them into poetry and poetic rhyme, as it were, in order to carry across the emotion that took place during these particular events. After Barak, we have Gideon. Gideon is most famous for whittling down his men based on their drinking style and then going and defeating the Midianites with torches and pitchers. The Lord throws them all into confusion, so the Midianites end up killing each other. This is a very significant story, one that's referenced again in the book of Isaiah. It's a very important part of Israel's history as they defeat the Midianites here. It's also famous because of the fact that Gideon lays out a fleece prior to actually going and attacking, which is not a good thing. Oftentimes Christians will say, I'm laying out a fleece. What that basically means is, I do not believe the direct revelation of God, because Gideon has the direct revelation of God from the angel of the Lord, who he knows to be the angel of God, who he knows to be God himself. And yet he doesn't listen when the angel tells him what he's supposed to do. He also doesn't listen each time that he lays out the fleece. Eventually, it will take him hearing the dream between two Midianite soldiers before he actually trusts that God is going to give him success. In the end, he does have success, and he goes out and pursues the Midianites. He also calls out the men of the hill country of the Ephraimites to come and attack. The Ephraimites actually get a little upset at Gideon here, which is a significant part of the story, as we'll see later, because Gideon is able to smooth things over with the Ephraimites so that it doesn't lead to bloodshed. He does have problems with the town of Succoth, and eventually has to come back and teach them a lesson by beating them all with briars, but he doesn't kill any of the Israelites. He only kills the Midianites, kills their two kings, and then eventually takes over as judge for a long period of time. He's asked to be king, and he says, I will not be king, and yet he names his son Abimelech, which means my father is king, which makes it questionable whether or not Gideon really wanted to be king. He was in some ways acting like a king, and his son Abimelech certainly acts like a king. Abimelech takes over as the heir apparent, as it were, of Gideon because he kills all of his brothers, so he's the only one left, except for Jotham. Jotham curses Abimelech and says that fire is going to come out from Abimelech and consume whoever aligns with him, and that Abimelech himself is going to be destroyed. And that's certainly what happens. Abimelech burns down the town of Shechem, which is actually the town that he's from. He burns down that town, killing all the elders, and when he tries to do it in the next town, it doesn't work. Instead, somebody throws a millstone at him and crushes his head, killing him. So in the end, Abimelech passes away to no one's regret. Unfortunately, that is not Gideon's only legacy. He also makes an ephod and gives it to his family, and for whatever reason, he thinks that that's a good idea, and they begin to worship it and to serve it and not to pay attention to God. Instead, they worship this particular ephod in the town of Ophrah, which is Gideon's hometown. And we're told in the text that it becomes a snare to Gideon and his family. So presumably Gideon himself was worshiping with it. So not a very good legacy for Gideon here. The land has peace for 40 years, and yet in the end we find that the people go right back because Gideon has not led them away from the false worship that they were doing, even engaging it in himself, and also engaging in the actions of a king, having a bunch of concubines, which are typically found with allegiances between kings of one land and kings of another. So Gideon is acting like a king. He's leading Israel's worship like a king, obviously in the wrong direction, but he's claiming not to be a king. All in all, while Gideon has a great victory, the legacy that he leaves behind is not great. In fact, it just continues that downward trajectory in Israel, especially when we get to the craziness of Abimelech, or Avimelech, and then beyond. After Gideon and two minor judges, we have Jephthah. Jephthah is interesting in that he is not raised up by God as judge. Instead, the Israelites come and raise him up as judge. The Gileadites themselves, Gilead being a major town in Manasseh, which again was the tribe of Gideon, is also here the tribe of Jephthah. Jephthah's mom was a prostitute, and the men of Gilead come and find him and say, you need to come back and rescue us from the Ammonites. It's also interesting in that chapter 11 immediately follows after chapter 10 in most Bibles, and in chapter 10 we read of the great repentance of Israel after God says that he's no longer going to help them. They weep, they offer sacrifices, they get rid of their false gods, and so God says that he's going to deliver them. And yet the immediate action that takes place afterwards is not Israel crying out to God to deliver them. Instead, as the Ammonites are coming and attacking, the Israelites assemble and decide that they're going to go find a judge. And so they go and find Jephthah the Gileadite, who is a mighty warrior. Israel is repentant, at least in chapter 10, but doesn't seem to have actually put their faith in God to deliver them. They're still orchestrating events here, trying to get things worked out on their own. Jephthah and the king of the Ammonites debate back and forth. Eventually, Jephthah will attack the Ammonites. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, and he crosses over Gilead and Manasseh, goes through Mizpah, which is where the Israelites had assembled in chapter 10, and fights against the Ammonites. Unfortunately, Jephthah makes a rash vow here and says whatever comes out of the door of his house, when he returns, he will give it to the Lord as a burnt offering. And that's exactly what we see take place. His daughter is the first one out, and in my opinion, he does offer her up as a burnt offering. After she has mourned for the fact that she will never marry, after she mourns her virginity, I believe that he really does offer her up as a burnt offering. Jephthah is not aware of the law, not aware that there is a way to redeem people from a vow, so that he could have redeemed her. He doesn't know the law. Apparently, the priests have not been teaching the law. Nobody seems to understand the law in Israel in these days. So that's one mark against Jephthah. The other mark against Jephthah is the fact that he attacks the Ephraimites. We remember back in the story of Gideon that the Ephraimites were called out and that they came out and got mad at Gideon for not calling them out sooner. Well, the same happens here in chapter 12. Jephthah calls out the Ephraimites, and the Ephraimites get mad again. Why didn't you call us out? Why did you go without us? Jephthah, instead of smoothing things over like Gideon, seizes the fords of Jordan and decides to kill everybody from the Ephraimites who can't say the word shibboleth correct. Instead, they say the word sibboleth with an S instead of an SH, and in the end, Jephthah and his followers end up killing 42,000 Ephraimites. Now, just to put this into perspective, that is more men than all of the judges killed of the enemies of God put together. Jephthah has killed more Israelites than enemies of God die in the entire book of Judges, which again shows that we have sunk pretty low in Israel. He doesn't know the law. He sacrificed his own daughter. He's making rash vows. He was not raised up by God as a judge. He seems to have been raised up by the men of Gilead themselves. And now he is killing 40+ thousand men of Israel, more than even the Ammonites that he killed. We have sunk pretty low with Jephthah, and at this point we might be thinking that we can't go any lower. But just wait. Next we have Samson. Samson's story begins oddly. There's a vision that takes place as the angel of God appears to both Samson's mom and Samson's dad. They see the angel of the Lord go up in the flames of the altar and the sacrifice that they have made to God. They know that this is God, the God of Israel, that they've seen Yahweh. They're afraid they're going to die, and yet they name Samson after a foreign god. Samson's name is really based on the three-letter root Shemesh, Shemesh being the Hebrew word for sun, but also the word for sun, the god of the sun, in the Canaanite religion. We have O-N at the end of Samson's name, which is often called a diminutive. It's very much like the letter Y in English, where we have Jim and Jimmy. So here we have sun and, well, literally sunny. So here we've gone a step further than Gideon's lack of faith. Gideon saw God, knew that it was God, and didn't believe what he said. Here we have Samson's parents apparently not only ignoring what the angel said, since they never enforced the whole idea of Samson being a Nazirite vow, where they go and they take a Philistine woman to be Samson's wife, but we also have them naming their son after a foreign god. We have continued to sink low. Samson is said to have judged Israel for 20 years, which really complicates things in terms of what a judge is, since we don't see Samson doing anything good for Israel over those 20 years other than killing Philistines every once in a while when he loses his temper. In the end, Samson is a very tragic figure. He dies at the hands of the Philistines, actually by his own hands as he knocks the temple over that they're all gathered in. He ends up having problems with women repeatedly. Each time he escapes, and yet in the end he is captured, his eyes are put out, and his hair is cut because of Delilah. So rather than having Barak being helped by his wife, or his prophetess, Deborah, rather than having Othniel being helped by his wife, we have Samson who's being led astray by women. So we have really gone downhill in Israel. We have judges who are no longer striking at the enemy. Instead, we have judges who are literally marrying and sleeping with the enemy, as he has concubines from Philistia in Gath, as he takes two wives from the Philistines. We see the tension that exists between Samson and God throughout his whole lifetime, and yet Samson is mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11 alongside Gideon. So even though we've sunk low, and even though at first glance we might think that Samson's not even a believer, we recognize that God indeed used Samson, used him mightily in order to deliver Israel, so that he was said to have served as a judge for 20 years in Israel, whatever that might mean. He accomplished great things by setting them free, not completely destroying them, as we'll continue to have problems with Philistines in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, but at least we begin the initial defeat of the Philistines here under Samson. Samson reminds us that God can use anyone, even somebody as messed up as Samson. Chapters 17 through 21 also have a macro structure, as the chapters have a constant refrain repeated after four sections. There was no king in those days, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Chapter 17, after verse 5, after we read Micah telling his mother that he took the silver she was looking for, we read that there was no king in those days. Again, after verse 13 in chapter 17, after we read that he has made that into an idol and has found a random Levite to be the priest, we again read there was no king in those days. And then in chapter 18, after the Danites kidnap that Levite and make him their priest, we again read there is no king in those days. And then after chapter 21, we also read that there was no king in those days, after the whole incident in Gibeah with the butchering of the people in Benjamin. So this is the structure of these four chapters. It's not a random occurrence of the statement. It actually divides up these four chapters into their four respective sections, each section being a slightly different part of the story, all of it holding together chapters 17 through 21. So this debunks the theory that chapters 17 through 21 are simply a random group of appendices, random stories thrown together at the end of the book of Judges. There's definitely a structure here. There's definitely a progression of those stories. There's a reason that they all show up here. After chapter 18, where we read that there was no king in those days, we are reminded of the fact that the tribe of Dan in the north is also where we will read in 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 29 through 31, that Jeroboam builds a golden calf and places it in Bethel and Dan. A lot of similarities between 1 Kings chapter 12 and Judges chapter 18 about the involvement of the Danites worshiping a false god. Many scholars have suggested that the writer of Judges was familiar with the fact that Dan had the golden calf and inserts this story in chapter 18 to allude to a previous story involving idolatry in Dan. But again, what's important to remember in these last four chapters is the macro structure. Just as the first three chapters of the book of Judges had a structure that divided it into two smaller subsections, so here we have four sections that are divided up by the constant refrain. There was no king in those days, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Of course, the fact that there was no king in those days suggests that there is a king now, or that there was a time when there was a king that the writer of Judges is familiar with, which would suggest then that the writer of Judges is living in a later era of the monarchy, when he is familiar with the king that reigns in Jerusalem or with the king that reigns in Samaria. But either one, he seems to be suggesting that there was no king because there is now. And yet at the same time, there is an irony to the statement that there was no king because there was a king. God was king. We'll find this out especially in 1 Samuel chapter 1, where God is called the Lord of hosts, in 1 Samuel chapter 8, where God tells Samuel that they have rejected him as king, and they really rejected God as king. So here in the end of Judges, we're really anticipating what is coming in the book of 1 Samuel, so that these last chapters provide sort of a bridge between the era of the Judges and the circumstances in Israel, especially when we come to Gibeah in chapters 19 through 21. Then we certainly have an allusion to 1 Samuel, because this refers ahead to Saul. Chapters 19 to 21 certainly anticipate Saul, although they look back in Israel's history to another checkered past, the story of Lot. You may remember that Lot is in Sodom and Gomorrah. They're trying to rescue him because of the prayers of Abraham. So two angels have come and are going to stay in the city square. Lot tells the men, no, you can't stay there. You need to stay with me. Lot also offers his daughters to the men of the city. Although in the story in Judges, it's not a daughter, it's a concubine. And yet the story is very similar. Although in Judges, the men actually take up the offer, they take the woman, whereas in the book of Genesis, they do not take the offer. They instead decide that they do want to continue to fight in order to get access to the men until the two angels end up blinding the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah and then rescuing Saul and taking him out. Here, the story's a little different, although there's certainly allusions to Sodom and Gomorrah, and yet that shows how far we've come, that now a section of Israel is being referred to as wicked as Sodom and Gomorrah. The fact that there are ties to King Saul, though, could be a historical allusion or an attempt to make Saul look bad, and scholars go back and forth on both of those, because there are multiple ties to King Saul. There is the fact that Gibeah is his hometown. There's the cutting up of the yoke of oxen in chapter 11, verse 7 of 1 Samuel, where Saul sends sections of the yoke of oxen to all the different tribes of Israel in order to call them out so that they can go and save the men of Gilead. Here in Judges, the story is a little more twisted because the Levite actually sends sections of his concubine to all the 11 tribes to come out and attack Benjamin. Ramah is mentioned specifically as the destination of the Levite, which is where Saul went to meet Samuel to find out about the donkeys. We're told that there were 600 survivors in Bethlehem. We're told that there were 600 men who followed after Saul. So we have these allusions that are at least anticipating 1 Samuel and the arrival of Saul as king, perhaps intended to shame Saul into saying Saul also is from Gibeah and he's connected to this low point in Israel's history, or just simply poetically to serve as a seam going from this story to Saul. Maybe it's more of a positive instead of a negative. The negative being Saul is from Gibeah, but the positive being, sure, Benjamin had this low point, but look, their man became king. See, he's rescuing Israel. He's serving as not just a judge, but as a king over Israel. But the biggest problem is that Israel is killing Israel. Israel is wiping out an entire tribe of the Israelites. This is definitely the low point, which is really what it's intended to be. The book of Judges ends on a low point. We have really reached the low point here in the book of Judges and the low point in Israel's history, as what began as a cherem in chapter 1 and 2 of devoting to destruction the nations that are living in Canaan, we are instead devoting to destruction and attempting to do a cherem of a tribe of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin. Again, we started with Judah being very positively considered in chapter 1, and now we have Benjamin being very negatively considered at the end of the book. Coincidence? David's from Judah, Saul is from Benjamin. So I lean towards no, I don't think this is coincidence. I think the writer of Judges is attempting to show that there's something wrong with Benjamites. Again, perhaps an allusion to Saul, as if to say, well, this is where Saul came from. Again, portraying Judah in a very positive light, portraying the need for a king, putting those two together, portraying the need for David, a king and somebody from the tribe of Judah. But the writer of Judges has certainly crafted his book so that the book goes downhill, potentially selecting only those stories that go downhill, but yet still crafting it to show that this is what happens when we reject God as king, when we don't do what we're supposed to and God hands us over to our sin. Judges is a very depressing book, and yet even as it's depressing and ending on that refrain of there being no king, it's no king in those days, again setting the stage for 1 Samuel. So these last few chapters are really a bridge, a transition between the period of the Judges to the rest of 1 and 2 Samuel, looking ahead to David, being also ironic about the fact that God is king, which was true throughout the whole book of Judges, But again, we're reminded of the crafting of this book by the writer of Judges. This is not just a series of random stories, but they've been put together in such a way so as to communicate a practical and theological point to us as readers and to all Israel as readers, so that we reach the low point here with the Benjamites. Having started with Judah, having started with Deborah, we finish with Delilah, we finish with Samson, we finish with the kidnapping of wives in Shiloh. We have sunk that low. But thankfully, this is not the end of the story. David is coming.